responsive. Later, we watched a playtest where the tester discovered this interaction immediately upon arriving in Ravenholm and interpreted it as a feedback that the gravity gun was hurting the zombie, which it was, just not very much. So they zapped the zombie again, repeatedly, shocking it over and over until it died. This is a slow, unfun, inhumane way to fight zombies, especially where you're surrounded by saw blades and explosive canisters. Having learned our lesson, we removed that flinch animation, even though it meant losing that interaction between the zombie and the gravity gun. In this case, it was better to not have the simple interaction rather than give the false impression that the gravity gun was an effective way to fight zombies. Even simple principles can require trade-offs when you get into the details.
Grigori Plaza. This open plaza is one of the areas that was fully detailed in our first development pass, and when we returned to it, we wanted to preserve as much of the existing art as possible while designing a new player path that used all 3 dimensions, moving players up and down, through windows, across rooftops, and between buildings. It wasn't a large space, so we had to squeeze as much track out of it as possible, and since that started as an art-focused area, it was light on gameplay and we needed to address that playtesters tended to fly right through it. And to top that off, it was already pushing our rendering performance budget with little room left for anything new. The challenge became finding small additions to slow the player down by adding threats around corners and into every nook and cranny of the level.
I have to say, I'll keep my eye on you. More than that, I cannot promise.
Hallway cupboards. These junk-filled hallways were a simple solution to our need to slow the player down. With the constraint of preserving as much of the existing geometry as possible, combined with slow-moving zombies as the main enemy, it was tricky to stop players from just sprinting through here. Luckily, having Grigori as the crazed inhabitant of Ravenholm made these setups easy to justify. It makes good sense that he'd clog the stairwell to keep himself safe on the rooftops. In the end, Grigori's solution and ours were one and the same. Just throw a bunch of furniture in the way, because if it stops zombies, it'll probably slow the player down too.
Even with all the work we did to try and make a connection between this lever and the outside electric fence in the players' minds, some testers would still flip the lever and not know what they'd done. They'd even wander around, flip the lever back on, and wander around some more. With not much time to spend on making the connection clearer, we elected to just have the lever break off. This prevented players from undoing their progress and added to the feeling that Ravenholm was an unreliable and decaying environment.
Poison headcrabs. This room unintentionally introduces poison headcrabs. We'd spent a lot of time crafting their proper introduction later in the level, but once we saw how well they were playtesting, our excitement got the better of us, and before too long we'd scattered them throughout the level. By the time we realized they'd appeared before their intro, it was really too late to rework it. Fortunately, a tight room of poison headcrabs works as decent training, because their design avoids a common issue with combat training. Typically, players are stressed and they can get frustrated if they die repeatedly without understanding why. And sure enough, We encountered that problem when trying to train the player with both poison headcrabs and their source, the poison zombie. However, poison headcrabs can't kill the player by themselves, so while stressful, a room full of them at least avoids that frustration.
Fire trap. This fire trap was originally intended as a visual showpiece for the fire system before a level designer repurposed it as a gameplay element for Ravenholm. It was almost cut many times during development due to the performance impact on the low-end PCs because of all the overdraw involved with the transparent sprites. In the end, there was a programmer who felt that it was important enough to the gameplay that it was worth doing the work to solve the performance issues and make sure we could get it into the game.
Well done, brother. Make free use of my traps, but take care not to fall in them yourself. Behind you! In Ravenholm, you do well to be...
Minor fracture detected.
We all went to Ravenholm. When fans talk to us about Half-Life 2, Ravenholm is often the most remembered section. Thanks to its multiple development passes and the density of the material in it, more members of the team are represented in Ravenholm than anywhere else. It was where we figured out how to apply our artistic pipeline to the set pieces and mood we wanted, how physics and gameplay combined with the gravity gun, how headcrabs and zombies need to evolve for Half-Life 2, and much more. Looking back on it now, it reassures our belief in individual empowerment over centralized design. Ravenholm is dense, highly efficient in its gameplay and artistic execution, and the sum of many small contributions by individuals who understood how they could push it just a little further with their own unique capabilities.
Car crushers. These car crushers required some adjustments and quite a bit of work to our physics damage system. There's always a challenge when big physics objects interact with non-player characters. For instance, if the physics can push the NPC, it might shove them somewhere they're not supposed to go, leaving them unable to recover. This isn't a big issue for something like a headcrab, which can just hop out of a tricky situation, but for something like a zombie, it could mean they get stuck and end up helpless, flailing away in whatever gap they manage to wedge themselves into, which kind of kills the survival horror mood we're going for here.
Car Crusher lifts. Getting the car crushers to lift the player was also tricky. See, the player is always being simulated by both the physics system and the game's movement system. Each time we update the player's state, we compare the results from both systems and decide which one is right, then sync them up and repeat. This allows the two systems to influence each other. Like when the player stands on a seesaw, the physics lets the board give way, or when they stand on the car crusher, it lifts them up. While more complex, this dual system approach was easier to tune than trying to handle both physics and player movement in a single system. By keeping them separate, we could fine-tune the player movement system to feel good on its own, only reconciling the two when physics was affecting the player.
Better and better. I am Father Grigori. You have already met. My congregation. Rest, my child. Ah, it is you, brother. I apologize. But no harm done. My bullets are the least of your concerns. Woe to thee.
Pacing switch. Now that the player's through the training section, we can start shifting the pacing from moody, claustrophobic spaces to more combat-focused action arenas. With the player familiar with the various physics tools in the environment, we can start mixing those into open spaces and just give the player the freedom to choose their approach.
Ammunition depleted. Laceration detected.
Although they call me crazy, I care not, for thou art my helper, my strength, and my savior.
Tables and bodies. Towards the end of Ravenholm's production, with all the major pieces in place, we went through and tried to fill out every bit of empty space with something interesting. In doing so, we had to be careful to use what we already had and not create anything new, as we couldn't risk introducing more bugs. Often, as in this room, we were trying to add new moments of gameplay, while also adding more detail and storytelling to the area. Small scenes like this allow an attentive player to think about what they're seeing and what it might mean for what they'll encounter next.
Fast Zombie Introduction. This space was another area originally built for E3 2003, where it showcased the player fighting against a squad of Combine soldiers. When we returned to use it to introduce the fast zombie, we tried to keep as much of the previous work as possible. We wanted an iconic moonlit shot with zombies leaping past the moon like werewolves to draw the player's eye. Once that beat is over, we introduce the first fast zombie to the player space and send it at them. It took a lot of iteration to find the right balance of lighting for the scene to look good, while ensuring it also worked for the gameplay goals.
Physics object consistency. All physics objects have a variety of parameters that define their behavior: their mass, the amount of damage they take before breaking, what they break into, and so on. During development, these parameters were specified by level designers for each item, which is how most things in the game worked. But later in development, we realized we'd created a problem for ourselves. There were thousands of physics objects in the game, and no method to ensure consistency across them. As a result, a cardboard box might break apart with a single pistol shot in one level and be completely invulnerable in another. Internally, we generally referred to these inconsistencies as level designer crimes. To fix these, and to deliver some justice, we built a system that enforced consistency on all physics objects based on their visual model. Since most of the game had already been built, we were forced to allow level designers to explicitly opt out of this system for rare edge cases where they needed to do something criminal to preserve what they'd designed. Internally, we refer to these designers as recidivists, some of whom perpetuate their life of crime at Valve to this day.
Here, brother! Come closer. You've stirred up hell. A man after my own heart. Here, I have a more suitable gun for you. You'll need it. Catch! Good. Now, keep it close. My advice to you is, aim for the head. Hush. They come. There is no rest in Ravenholm. Move on and I will meet you at the church.
Poison Zombie Introduction. Constraining the player in a tight space while providing them with a view outward is a useful way to increase the chances that they'll notice something we want them to see. Here, we draw the player's attention with the sound of a wail before the poison zombie itself becomes visible. Originally, this encounter was also the first time players faced poison headcrabs, but as mentioned in an earlier node, we got far too enthusiastic in proliferating poison headcrabs around the level and ended up spoiling their joint introduction here. In the end, however, these first encounters worked better as separate instances anyway.
Gamma correction. Our game engine has a rendering system that's responsible for taking the entire state of the game and calculating a color value for every pixel on your screen to represent that state. But code and software from other people are involved in the process of calculating those pixels as well. As an example, the software and hardware in your GPU and monitor. At one point during development, we were unhappy with how our characters looked. In particular, we thought that they looked waxy or sickly. Their skin was wrong. We spent some time tuning our lighting, but we just couldn't get both our characters and our world to look right. Luckily, we still had a fully featured software renderer, which allowed us to run the game without a GPU, because this was an era where many players still didn't have one. And looking at the game on that renderer, we noticed that our lighting didn't have the same problem. So we went through our code with a fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out where our rendering code was doing something wrong when it was working with a GPU. After failing to do so, we tried talking to the GPU manufacturers, asking them to double-check they weren't doing anything wrong with the pixel values we were passing them. That was the start of a long journey, and long story short, it was a journey of almost 2 years of back-and-forth communication with GPU manufacturers before we were able to convince them that they were doing gamma correction incorrectly in the low-level math on their cards. During this, we'd even had to build a system that validated the color values of an individual pixel throughout the entirety of our rendering pipeline. But eventually, at the end, we finally got new drivers back for them, and our characters immediately looked like they should, matching the software renderer.
At this point in Ravenholm, the player has learned all the gameplay elements available to them and can predict their interactions. This allows us to build more complex setups, providing a greater level of threat and more freedom in how the player can approach each scenario. This arena is a deliberately entwined space that the player will need to explore, and we use that exploration time to slowly ramp up combat intensity. The faster the player explores, the faster we ramp it up. The freeform nature of this design made it challenging to tune, given the large dynamic range in how players played through it.
Blood toxin levels detected.
Playtester archetypes. Iteration and regular playtest were the lifeblood of Half-Life 2's production. Every week, we'd quietly watch over the shoulder of a player going through the section we were working on, taking notes on what worked and what didn't. It was important for us to test with a wide range of skill levels, to be sure that we weren't making decisions that only worked for some. Over time, we learned to choose specific types of playtesters based on the development stage we were at. Early on, we used experienced gamers, usually teammates, who could handle rough, unfinished areas and were good at explaining their thought process. For combat testing, we'd find players of all skill levels, especially those creative in their usage with the tools. Finally, as sections became more polished, we'd focus on beginners, people who didn't play games much or weren't familiar with first-person shooters. Even if they weren't necessarily someone who might buy the game, we often learned something valuable from watching them.
final arena. When we finished the first pass over Ravenholm, this rooftop was intended to be the culminating fight. Like other spaces in Ravenholm, it had begun life as a space purely focused on being an interesting visual location. We felt it was important that, as the player left Ravenholm, they had a moment to look back over the town they had just survived and get a glimpse of where they were headed next. Multiple gameplay groups took a shot at building a fight here, but the tight geometry and performance constraints meant we never really created a finale we were happy with. Not unlike the Half-Life saga itself, it seemed as if Ravenholm was destined to not have a real ending.
Almost there, brother. No, brother, step into the cart. The handbrake, brother. Release it and come down. Greetings, brother. And so we meet at last. You are to be commended for avoiding my traps. The work of a man who once had too much time on his hands and now finds time for nothing but the work of salvation. I suspect you have little wish to remain in Ravenholm, so I will show you to the mines. As for me, a shepherd must tend to his flock, especially when they have grown unruly. Follow me, brother, and tread lightly, for this is hallowed ground.
Response rules. We knew early on that we wanted a lot of dynamic dialogue in-game, so we needed a system to handle it effectively. We aimed for a system that allowed sound designers to add and tweak lines without involving programmers, made the dialogue tightly responsive to the game's state, and minimized repetition. With these requirements, we created the response rules system. Whenever a character speaks outside of a choreographed scene, this system determines which line to deliver. Rather than picking up lines directly, character AI is constantly flagging opportunities for speech whenever a relevant event happens. Spotting the player, getting hurt, firing a last round in a gun, encountering overwhelming enemies, and so on. With each opportunity, it sends the response rules system a packet of data about the game's current state, and the system returns the most fitting dialogue line, if there is any. This setup allowed our sound designers to create a detailed decision matrix for dialogue. For example, a character might have a different set of lines for announcing a reload while under fire versus after the end of a fight, or if only one ally is left standing, or if there's a strider in sight, etc. By the time we shipped Half-Life 2, we felt we'd only scratched the surface of this system's potential. It became a core feature of Episode 1's Alyx, and went on to power the dynamic dialogue in our later games, including TF2's classes and the cast of Left 4 Dead.
The real final arena. Very late in the development of Half-Life 2, when we were reviewing the entire game for final improvement opportunities, we decided we did, in fact, want a real finale for Ravenholm. The rooftop fight wasn't enough. After some discussion, we chose to add this final fight through the graveyard with Grigori alongside the player. It was risky, development-wise, but we felt the game needed it. Since we were near the end of production, we had a mature set of gameplay tools to work with, but even more importantly, by this point, we understood our own game. Making a game is often a process of learning what it is you're actually creating. Why is our game fun? How is it different? What are the most important elements? As we built the game and watched playtesters go through it, we learned answers to those questions and, in turn, got better at making it. So the graveyard came together quickly and required far less iteration than many earlier areas of the game.
Where art thou, brother? May the light of lights be with you!
Mission deeply.
Balm for your affliction, child. Follow me. Quickly, brother. Return to your true nature. I remember your true face. Be free, my child. Hurry while I hold the gate! Farewell, brother. I fear I deliver you to a darker place. May the light of lights illuminate your path. Look to your own salvation.
Sniper Alley. This section of Game Track was added late in development, after we moved Eli's lab and Ravenholm to come before Coast. While you might think that we build the game linearly, we actually split up into 3 different groups and worked in parallel on different sections, starting mostly in the middle of the game. Each group's first pass focused on nailing down the core of their section before they moved on. And then once we had a rough version of the whole game laid out, we went back over each section to polish it, adding successful elements from other areas and removing what wasn't working. In some cases, such as in Ravenholm, entire sections were moved. And then, after Ravenholm was relocated, we needed a new piece to connect it to the coast, which is the area you're entering now. Given the time constraints, this short section was built using existing, proven gameplay elements, like snipers and combine soldiers.
Half-Life 2's physics gave us a variety of tools to make combat more exciting. For instance, when enemies miss the player, we subtly redirect their shots toward breakable objects nearby, adding mayhem and creating that action movie feel. We also employed physics to add hints. We created what we called ragdoll magnets across the game to make enemy corpses fall in interesting and dramatic ways, such as off ledges or into the path of a train.
Snipers. The Half-Life 2 team was never very large, so we were always looking for ways to create new gameplay without high asset production costs. The sniper is a great example. It has no actual model, just a laser beam, so it required no art or animation support. When it dies, it simply spawns a Combine Soldier ragdoll and launches it out the window. Despite that simplicity, we got a lot of unique gameplay from it. We were especially happy with how it interacted with the physics objects in the game world. Players are used to exploiting explosive objects near enemies, so it felt fitting to have an enemy that flipped that dynamic when the player was in cover.
it?
Patch him up and get him to the back as soon as he's stable. Gordon Freeman. It's incredible you made it. We've been getting communications from Alex. I'll see if I can reach her again. Follow me. It's Leon. We're all clear. And I've got Gordon Freeman.
Dr. Freeman, you're kidding. Look, I've been on the line with Alex. Her father's been captured.
Over here, Dr. Freeman.
Eli Vance is indispensable to the liberation.
Alex, it's Leon. And I've got Gordon Freeman with me.
Gordon, you made it through Ravenholm. Thank God. I need your help. They've taken my father. He's been taken to Nova Prospect. The Vortigaunts tracked the ship that made off with him and Judith Mossman. While the trains are still running, I'm gonna hitch a ride. Here's where you come in, Gordon. I need you to make your way along the coast until you get to Nova Prospect.
Coast kickoff. This interstitial scene came along late in development to connect Ravenholm to Coast. Noticing a trend? Quite a bit of the connective tissue in our games comes together late. In this case, that meant cutting corners wherever possible. We didn't even have time to animate Alex on the monitor. These kinds of scenes are always a challenge to make interesting, and we didn't succeed with this one. It's a good example of what happens when NPCs are treated like signposts without adding character to them or the scene. The result is a forgettable moment where the game's seams show. But that's the nature of development. You only have so much time, and you have to decide where to spend it. Kleiner's lab and Eli's lab were much more important, so that's where we focused our efforts.
Okay, Doc. Before you hit the road, you might want to grab some med kits, restock on ammo, maybe check the map, see where you're headed. There's an ammo supply crate on the back of the car, if that's any comfort. Stay with the car, make use of the thumpers. You'll stand a fair chance against the antlions. I'll radio ahead to let the next base know you're coming. Shore point to NLO. Shore point to New Little Odessa. New Odessa, you read.
Buggy model. The Buggies model went through many iterations before reaching its final version. We cycled through designs that satisfied both our artistic and physics simulation needs, but then hit an unexpected issue. Many playtesters, even experienced FPS players, were getting motion sick while driving it. Along with some simulation tweaks, we discovered that altering the buggy model helped. The more the model obscured the world, the worse the motion sickness became. So we began stripping away parts of the model, removing more and more of the body until players stopped feeling sick. In particular, being able to see the ground through the missing undercarriage made a noticeable difference.
Buggy introduction. We wanted something more engaging for the buggy's introduction than just having the player hop in and drive away. The crane helped with that. Crucially, we needed players to learn how to recover the buggy when it flips over, and this sequence forced them into that situation. Training under pressure is always tricky. We wanted to emphasize the antlion infestation as the reason to stay inside the buggy. So we kept the antlion threat active and provided a couple of citizens on mounted guns for support. A small bonus, players also get the experience of being lifted by the crane just before they'll get to operate one.
Good, here we go. Damn magnet's failing. Hold on. Sorry, Doc.
Buggy training course. This training section was designed to let the player play around with her buggy.
At the time Half-Life 2 was released, this level of physical simulation in the vehicle was novel, so we wanted to give players ample opportunity to experiment with it. A player has also just left the tight confines of Ravenholm, and we liked giving them the contrast and reward of being able to move quickly through a large space, feeling safe inside a vehicle. We made sure to require a turbo jump to get out of this area, which doubled as a test to make sure they'd reached a level of comfort in their driving, and also ensured that they didn't leave their buggy behind.
Buggy physics. The physics for a buggy took a lot of trial and error. We wanted it to feel fast, even though its top speed was only about 35 miles an hour. So we had to do some cheating to make it work. We added extra vertical force to the turbo jump and a bit of kick to the rear when using the handbrake to power slide. Without those, the low speed meant the buggy just wasn't fun to drive. On top of that, the world was full of unpredictable physics system-driven chaos. Players were bound to drive the buggy into all kinds of collisions, so we had to make sure that they could always get out. This took a lot of experimenting and playtesting. In the end, we settled on a pretty goofy, unrealistic simulation that made the buggy more forgiving and harder to flip. Its center of gravity is super low, and the wheels, while they look like they turn a lot, actually don't. It was our first attempt at a physically simulated vehicle, and we learned a ton from it. Thanks to that, we were able to make the muscle car in Episode 2 much easier to drive.
Transition tunnels. Building the coast required us to develop a way to handle level transitions. To move from one level to another, we need to save everything in the transition space as the player leaves the first level and restored in the next level after loading. Critically, we also have to save and restore everything visible to the player in the transition area, even if it lies outside the space itself. For this reason, we aim to keep transition spaces as small and enclosed as possible. In most of the game, a small room works well for this purpose, but on the coast, we needed a different solution. After some experimentation, we settled on dark tunnels. Besides being reusable in a believable way, the tunnels allowed us to add a bright light flare at the end to mask the fact that we can't render what's ahead of the player, because it exists in an entirely different level.